Hey, a quick message before we start today's show. We are so grateful to have you as a listener. And now we want to learn more about your listening habits and how you think that we can be better. We've got a new survey that we're running for a limited time, and we would love to hear from you. It shouldn't take more than 5 minutes to complete. And to do that, you go to washingtonpost.com/podcast survey. Again, that is washingtonpost.com/podcast survey. And even better, when you're done, you can enter to win a gift card, some worth up to $1,000. So if that got your attention, one more time, that is washingtonpost.com/podcast survey. Thank you so very much for your help with this. And here's today's show. Every day, Artem Brunjikov sees firsthand the costs of the war in Ukraine. Artem is a political analyst, and recently he drove several hundred miles through the eastern part of the country.
We're going from Kharkiv to Donetsk region, and we're going through cities which were under Russian occupation. And mostly of them are or completely destroyed or mostly destroyed, almost destroyed.
For Artem, witnessing the destruction is a reminder of just how important it is for Ukraine to have support from the United States. But for the first part of this year, that support wasn't there. Congress spent months debating whether to send any more aid to Ukraine. Finally, 2 weeks ago, President Biden signed a bill that sends them $61 billion. And now, money and weapons are reaching the country. But according to Artem, every day that aid wasn't there came at a huge cost.
So when you're going through such cities, you understand what the real price of political debates, because every day Ukrainians paid by their lives under Russian attacks. Every day somebody paid for their lives for these decisions.
Artem says that since help from the U.S. has started to arrive, the mood is changing. And so is Ukraine's approach for this next phase of the war.
I think we made a big step forward in understanding that war will not end it in one day. So now it's the question of our lives, of our future, of our independence, and we'll do everything that we can to win in this war.
At the same time, U.S. government officials recognize that even with billions of dollars and new weapons, winning the war right now might not be realistic. The Post national security reporter Missy Ryan says the Biden administration's expectations of Ukraine are modest.
Obviously, the passage of this supplemental funding for Ukraine was just incredibly welcome news for Ukraine and for President Biden after 6 months of delay. And as the situation grows more dire for Ukraine and Ukrainian troops. But at the same time, this is definitely not going to solve all of Ukraine's problems in this battle against Russia. And in some ways, now the really hard part begins.
From the newsroom of The Washington Post, this is Post Reports. I'm Martine Powers. It's Monday, May 6th. And today, the outlook on the war in Ukraine. The optimism that you heard from Artem is shared by many Ukrainians. But right now, the American view focuses less on the outcome of the war and more on Ukraine's immediate future. So I sat down with Missy to talk about whether U.S. aid will actually make a difference in the short term and how Ukraine is approaching a third year of fighting against Russia. So to understand why this moment is so challenging, I think it's important to get a sense of where exactly this war stands. Can you kind of describe basically how Ukraine is doing in this war against Russia at this point?
Yeah, so more than 2 years into the war, there have been victories and setbacks for each side. But at this stage, Russia still controls a fifth of Ukrainian territory. And there are no signs that Russia intends or is going to be forced to leave Ukraine anytime soon. And while Ukraine has made some really important gains and has been able to take back territory from Russia since the beginning of the war, it continues to have these very strategic disadvantages, starting with the fact that the population is just much smaller for Ukraine. That means the manpower pool, the pool of soldiers that it has to draw from is much smaller. It has a much smaller and less sophisticated military than Russia does. So even while the United States and these other Western countries have rallied to Ukraine's support and promised to help it defend itself, it's in some ways an asymmetric challenge from the beginning. And those disequilibrium really is not changing as the war goes on, and there are more and more questions about the West staying power and in fueling Ukraine's battle.
Well, so given the fact that Ukraine remains, as you said, essentially the underdog here, what exactly is this money buying them? Like, what are we sending over to them, and what will they be able to do with it?
Yeah, so there were $61 billion approved by Congress last month. And what the Biden administration did right away after getting this bill passed was announce an immediate $1 billion package, basically of military donations, weaponry donations from American military stockpiles. And the reason why they do that rather than procuring new weapons is that they can take them out of warehouses. Some of the material was actually pre-positioned in Europe to make it faster for Ukraine. And so they were able to donate things like air defense missiles, artillery rounds, armored vehicles. Even in recent weeks, they've donated some longer-range missiles, which Ukraine has really wanted. And so the idea was to help Ukraine immediately start digging out of this hole that it's gotten into in recent months, as it's really been starved of firepower because the United States has been the largest supplier of weaponry by far to Ukraine. And it has been outgunned on the battlefield, something like 5 or 6 to 1 in artillery. And that is just a really difficult situation for Ukraine. That means that it's harder for them to defend positions. It means that they're losing more men than they might otherwise. And so this really is seen as a lifeline from the Zelensky government.
And in terms of those donated weapons that came out of warehouses, has that stuff arrived in Ukraine yet? Like, is it on the battlefield? Are Ukrainians using it?
So within days of President Biden signing the bill, there was stuff going into Ukraine.
I'm making sure the shipments start right away. In the next few hours, literally the few hours, we're going to begin sending in equipment to Ukraine for air defense munitions, for artillery, for rocket systems, and armored vehicles.
Most of it comes through Poland. And so, they're getting trucked into Ukraine and hopefully then getting dispersed and going to the battlefields where they can start helping Ukraine hold positions better, hit farther into Russian-held territory, so to hit weapons depots, command and control centers, logistics hubs, all of those kind of things. And even if the weaponry takes a little while to get there, just the fact that Ukraine knows it's coming means that it can sort of spend down what it has without worrying about running out.
I'm sure a lot of this is what American officials want to hear, right? That these weapons are going to be used immediately, that they're going to help Ukraine better be able to defend itself. But I want to come back to a point that you made earlier, that there is this one thing that the U.S. government cannot buy or donate to Ukraine, and that's Ukrainian people, specifically Ukrainian men, to serve in the military, and that the lack of manpower has been this ongoing struggle for the Ukrainian military. Can you talk a little bit about what that's looked like recently and some of the steps that they've tried to take to combat the fact that they just have fewer people than Russia does?
Yeah, I mean, it is a huge growing problem for Ukraine. I mean, from the beginning of the war, the Ukrainian military has sort of outperformed expectations. They've punched above their weight. They're small, but they're scrappy. They've been really smart about innovating. They've been smart about taking advantage of Russia's weaknesses. But at the same time, they have troops that have been fighting for 2 years, individuals who have been out there fighting, consistently for 2 years. And there's now a lot of fatigue that's set in. They don't have the ability to rotate forces in the ways that, ideally a military would. And they're getting to the point where there aren't as many people left to be able to volunteer. So they're having this ongoing debate about conscription. So President Zelensky has a pretty unenviable task ahead of him. There have been estimates saying that Ukraine needs to conscript up to 500,000 men.
Wow.
And that estimate, which was put out there by Zelensky's previous commander-in-chief, who he replaced a few months ago, is debatable. There's this ongoing question of whether or not they can make do with a much smaller number by sort of looking for forces that can, economizing forces essentially. But in any event, they do need a lot of people. And it's difficult for Zelensky to do that at a moment where there really isn't a clear victory in sight. And so they just took the step of decreasing the conscription age from 27 to 25. But the idea of widening conscription or implementing existing conscription system more aggressively is very unpopular.
After the break, I continue my conversation with Missy, where we talk about what it means for the U.S. to dedicate more money to a foreign war. We'll be right back. So, Missy, there's also this question about the number of actual casualties in Ukraine. So Ukraine says that their official casualty count is 30,000 people. That includes those in the military who were killed and also wounded. But there have been a lot of questions around that number and, frankly, accusations that Zelensky hasn't been honest about the number of Ukrainians who have died in the military because of concerns of what that could do to morale. Can you talk to me about some of those allegations and this sense that maybe we don't know exactly how tough this has been for Ukraine so far?
Yeah, I mean, it is a closely guarded secret in Ukraine what the true death toll is for the military. I think, as you say, it's something that they worry about in terms of being able to attract new soldiers to, just keep up this national unity and morale that has been really important since the beginning of the war. But, no matter what the true toll is, it is significant given the size of Ukraine's population and the size of its military. But, I might add, it is much smaller than what American officials believe the death toll for Russia has been, or it's sort of just been this meat grinder since the beginning of the war. American officials believe that more than 300,000 Russian troops have been killed or injured, which is obviously far higher. And, that I think just illustrates the brutal nature of this war and the extent to which, you've had this devastation on both sides, but it could really put Ukraine in a difficult position as it sort of tries to claw back to a point where it can start going back on the offensive. And I think that really gets to what the expectations are for this year and what can be hoped for with this new package of aid that's flowing in, all these new weapons that are flowing into Ukraine. So what we're hearing from American officials is that kind of at best what they hope will happen in 2024, for the remainder of 2024, is that Ukraine will be able to use this aid to more effectively hold off Russian troops, Russian advances, and use this year to refit, regroup, better train and equip their forces to then be able to go back on the offensive, maybe in 2025, maybe after that. And so the hope is that it really kind of underscores the extent to which this aid package is sort of necessary but not sufficient factor for Ukraine to be able to get to where it needs to be.
I think what you just said, for a lot of Americans who aren't following this war closely, is going to be a pretty bracing statement. The idea that there is not any realistic expectation that Ukraine, even with this aid, even with these weapons, that they have the ability to win this war by the end of this year. That really we're looking at how can we keep them kind of at the status quo until next year, where maybe they could try another counteroffensive to regain back some of this territory that they lost to Russia. And it seems like the outlook here is not that this war is going to conclude anytime soon, anytime even in the next few years.
It's a hard truth, but it's one that I just hear as something that is now accepted, at least within the analysis of the U.S. government. But I do think it is important to note that at the beginning of the war, the erroneous consensus within the U.S. government was that Ukraine was going to collapse within a week. that the government was going to collapse and that Russia would take over the capital. So the fact that they've not only has that not happened, but they've managed to hold on to so much of the country and take back a lot of territory, I think is really significant to remind ourselves. But they do have a lot of challenges. Going back to the Manpower, what they need to do is figure that problem out soon. And this is something that I've talked to analysts about. I've talked to U.S. government officials about. A lot of people think that 2024 is sort of the peak year for Russia, the year for which Russia's military advantage could be the strongest. And the hope is that this package can help them prevent that and then maybe tee things up for sort of a different balance in the future.
Yeah. Missy, I know that you're, talking about how there really is some reason for optimism here in terms of like what this could look like or how strong the Ukrainian military could be next year and coming years. But I do think that for a lot of Americans who hear this, they're going to hear echoes of other wars that we have fought in which we kind of continued to invest money and resources in conflicts that like ultimately weren't winnable or that there wasn't total transparency about how unwinnable they were at the time. I mean, what is your sense of like the concerns here at this moment that, and obviously these were concerns that were raised by Republicans who didn't want to vote for this foreign aid package, but that this is like pumping more money into conflict that like years down the road, we will say, like, what was never going to be really winnable from this point forward?
Yeah, I think it's a very valid question, and it's one that clearly some people in Congress are getting from their constituents. I would note that there is pretty widespread bipartisan support for Ukraine. There is a cadre of Republicans, especially, who question whether or not this is in U.S. interest. But the argument that supporters of Ukraine will make, and I think it's a pretty convincing one, is that it's much cheaper to have Ukraine fight Russia than have NATO fight Russia or the United States fight Russia. And Russia, for almost 2 decades now, has shown that it's not afraid of plowing into other countries. And there's no reason to think that Putin feels any different now. He certainly doesn't seem deterred. And so the argument is that, and this is something the Ukrainians have said again and again, is, look, we're not asking for you to come fight our wars. We're just essentially asking for the bullets. And if you think about the cost of U.S. military operations overseas, I always think about, what the cost of the operating the U.S. military activities in Afghanistan was at the height of the surge. I think it was like $10 billion a month versus what the United States has given to Ukraine since the beginning of the war, which is in the, it's significant. It's now in the many tens of billions, but it's not, it's not that expensive. It's not, $10 billion a month. And so I think what the Biden administration is saying is like, look, this is actually a good deal for us if we think that it's in our interest to not just stop Putin from reaching into parts of Eastern Europe, but also deter authoritarians elsewhere in the world.
Missy, thank you so much for unpacking all of this. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Missy Ryan covers national security for The Post. Before we go, Russian President Vladimir Putin is set to be inaugurated for a 5th term on Tuesday. It's an important moment for Russia, and a moment when our colleagues here at The Post are looking back on Putin's 25 years in power. In a new series called Russia Remastered, we've got reporting on the seismic changes that Putin is making in Russia. In particular, we look at his effort to forge an ultra-conservative society, one that rolls back women's rights, equates criticism of the war with terrorism, rewrites history, and indoctrinates a pro-war youth. It's a fascinating read, and again, the series is called Russia Remastered, and you can find it at WashingtonPost.com. Also, early Monday, Israel's military ordered 100,000 civilians to leave Rafah immediately and move to a humanitarian zone. But by Monday afternoon, there appeared to be movement toward resolution. Hamas said in a statement that it had contacted Arab mediators about a ceasefire proposal. Israel agreed to send mediators to try to negotiate, but they still plan to continue the operation in Rafah. That's it for Post Reports. Thank you so much for listening. And again, we would love your help with our podcast survey. to partake, you just go to washingtonpost.com/podcast survey. It'll take less than 5 minutes. Thank you so much. Today's show was produced by Ariel Plotnick with help from Emma Talkoff. It was mixed by Sean Carter and edited by Allison Michaels. I'm Martine Powers. We'll be back tomorrow with more stories from the Washington Post.